Have you ever felt that you notice things others completely miss? Subtle gestures, hidden threats, unspoken truths? You feel like your mind is awake while the world sleeps. You are alone with these thoughts, these perceptions, these patterns. In the shadows of a city, there exists someone who sees what most cannot. Someone who perceives patterns, motives, and dangers long before they happen. Someone who walks the line between insight and obsession. That someone is Batman. Batman's mind operates at the extreme edge of human perception. He notices the smallest movements, detects lies in subtle expressions, and connects threads of crime that others dismiss as coincidence. His perception gives him power, control, and the ability to act where ordinary minds falter. But it also comes with a cost, isolation, anxiety, and the constant weight of seeing more than he should. Human beings are wired to seek patterns. Evolution has trained us to notice faces in crowds, detect hidden danger, and anticipate threats before they arrive. This skill has saved lives for millennia, but sometimes the brain goes beyond the norm. It begins to see patterns in randomness, meaning in coincidence, and danger in the harmless. Psychologists call this apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. It can drive creativity, innovation, and survival. But it can also become a trap. When a mind like Batman's constantly sees hidden signals, even in innocuous events, the line between reality and perception blurs. The gift of hyper-awareness can become a prison. The psychological mechanisms behind seeing what others don't. Pattern recognition. Humans naturally search for patterns. It is how we learn, predict, and adapt. In hyper-perceptive individuals, this process is magnified. They detect micro-changes in behavior, subtle environmental cues, and the faintest signs of deception. Batman's crime fighting relies on this heightened ability. Every detail counts, a flicker of movement, a shadow in an alley, a glance that betrays intent. Hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a state of heightened awareness, often linked to stress, trauma, or innate sensitivity. People in this state can read tension in a room, detect fear, and anticipate danger. For Batman, this manifests as the constant scanning of Gotham. Every alley, every rooftop, every criminal movement is analyzed, cataloged, and acted upon. But hypervigilance is exhausting. It strains the mind and can lead to emotional and social costs. Cognitive biases. Even perceptive minds are not immune to distortion. Confirmation bias, noticing only what confirms pre-existing beliefs. Negativity bias, emphasizing threats over neutral or positive signals. Patternicity, interpreting random data as meaningful. Batman experiences these biases. His vigilance sometimes creates illusions of threats where none exist. This is part of the danger of seeing what others cannot. The mind overinterprets, and insight becomes obsession. Historical and psychological context. Several influential thinkers provide frameworks for understanding hyper-awareness. Carl Jung. Hyper-awareness requires confronting the shadow self, the unconscious parts of the psyche. Batman embodies this nightly, facing Gotham's criminals and his own inner darkness. Sigmund Freud. The tension between conscious action and unconscious drives explains Batman's compulsive mission. His perception is inseparable from trauma, fear, and desire for control. Machiavelli. Strategic foresight gives advantage, but can isolate the thinker. Batman constantly balances insight with risk, seeing enemies in shadows and potential allies as potential threats. These frameworks show that seeing what others don't is a double-edged sword. It can empower, enlighten, and save lives, but it can also weigh the mind down, foster paranoia, and create emotional isolation. The burden of hyper-awareness. The cost of seeing what others cannot is significant. Isolation. Individuals who perceive hidden truths may feel alienated. Their insights are often misunderstood, and their hyper-awareness makes normal social interaction exhausting. Batman experiences this every night. No one shares his perspective, and few understand the weight he carries. Paranoia and anxiety. Constantly perceiving threats can erode mental stability. Every shadow may hold danger. Every gesture may conceal intent. Over time, the mind becomes trapped in vigilance, where nothing is safe and everything is suspect. Decision fatigue. The more one perceives, the more one must act. Hyper-awareness generates countless possibilities, patterns, and threats to consider. Decision-making becomes exhausting. Batman's mental load is immense as he balances morality, strategy, and consequence on every action. Relationship strain. Trust is difficult when perception always searches for hidden motives. Those who see what others cannot may suspect betrayal even in allies. Batman's relationships are marked by this strain. Even his closest confidants are viewed through the lens of suspicion and analysis. Every night he scans the city. Every shadow could hide a threat, every whisper could carry deception. He sees patterns in chaos, connections in randomness. This is power. This is insight. This is also danger. Because the more you see, the less you rest. The more you know, the more you carry. Tonight, we explore what it truly means to see what others do not, through the eyes of a vigilante, through the lens of psychology, and through the understanding of the human mind. And we'll discover why hyper-awareness, as powerful as it is, can become a trap. No one is born seeing everything. No one wakes up one day with a mind that scans every shadow, questions every silence, and analyzes every movement. Hyper-awareness is not magic. It is built, and most of the time it is built from pain. Batman was not born hyper-aware, he was made. There was a night when safety collapsed, a moment when the world proved it could shatter without warning. From that moment forward, the brain changed, because trauma rewires perception. When the human brain experiences intense fear or loss, the amygdala, the part responsible for detecting danger, becomes more active. It learns quickly and remembers deeply. It decides that survival depends on vigilance. For Batman, the murder of his parents becomes more than tragedy. It becomes programming. The mind absorbs a brutal lesson. Danger appears suddenly. Safety is temporary. Trust is fragile, and you must always watch. This is how hypervigilance begins. This does not apply only to fictional heroes. In real life, people raised in unstable environments often develop similar patterns. Children who grow up around conflict learn to read tone shifts instantly. They notice changes in breathing. They feel tension before words are spoken. They predict emotional explosions before they happen. To outsiders, they appear perceptive. Inside, they are in survival mode. The brain adapts to protect itself. It sharpens perception, increases scanning, and becomes alert to microsignals. Hyper-awareness is not weakness, it is survival intelligence. From an evolutionary perspective, early humans who noticed subtle environmental changes survived longer. A sudden silence in birds, a broken branch, or a movement in tall grass could mean life or death. Those who ignored small cues did not survive long enough to reproduce. As a result, the brain evolved to detect patterns quickly, assume meaning, and anticipate threat. Batman represents this evolutionary trait at its extreme. He listens to silence, studies behavior, and sees connections between crimes others dismiss as coincidence. However, survival mode was never meant to be permanent. The nervous system is designed to cycle between alertness and calm. A hyper-aware brain struggles with this cycle. It remains switched on, even when danger has passed. Sleep becomes shallow. Thoughts remain active. The mind replays possibilities. What if I miss something? What if the threat is still there? What if next time I am too late? For Batman, the mission never ends. Even when Gotham is quiet, his mind is not. Anticipation consumes energy, and chronic hypervigilance is linked to anxiety disorders, stress-related exhaustion, and emotional fatigue. The brain becomes efficient at detecting danger but inefficient at experiencing peace. There is another psychological layer beneath this. Hyper-aware individuals often believe that if they see everything, they can prevent pain. If they predict every scenario, nothing will surprise them. If they prepare for every possibility, nothing can destroy them again. This belief creates the illusion of control. Batman studies criminals obsessively, builds contingency plans, and prepares counter-strategies even against his allies. He does this because unpredictability once shattered his world, and control now feels like safety. But total control is impossible. The brain was not designed to simulate every possible threat endlessly. When someone tries to do this, cognitive load increases, stress accumulates, and mental flexibility decreases. What begins as intelligence can become obsession. High intelligence combined with trauma and hyper-awareness can slowly fuse identity with mission. Batman does not simply fight crime. He becomes the fight against crime. Psychologically, this reflects identity fusion when purpose and self become inseparable. If the mission fails, the self feels threatened. If peace arrives, identity feels uncertain. Because if there is no threat to detect, who are you? This is one of the hidden dangers of seeing what others do not. When your mind becomes your weapon, you begin to live inside it. Socially, hyperperception creates distance. When you notice subtext in every conversation, you stop relaxing in dialogue. When you detect inconsistencies, you struggle to trust easily. When you analyze tone, posture, and timing constantly, social interaction becomes mental work. Batman operates alone not only because the mission demands it, but because few can understand the constant scanning happening inside his mind. In reality, highly perceptive individuals often report similar experiences. They feel mentally ahead of conversations, struggle with small talk, and become impatient with superficial interaction. They often feel exhausted after social gatherings. Perception creates awareness, awareness creates separation, and separation creates loneliness. Loneliness then deepens hyper-awareness, creating a psychological cycle. The more you see, the more you withdraw. The more you withdraw, the more your inner world intensifies. Eventually, worldview changes. When you constantly detect deception, you begin to expect deception. When you constantly anticipate danger, you begin to expect danger. Optimism weakens. Trust becomes conditional. Hope becomes cautious. Batman is not emotionally distant because he lacks feeling. He is distant because he sees too much. He carries information others never notice and processes threats others never detect. Carrying that weight reshapes personality. This is the psychological paradox. The same trait that creates power can create fragility. The same awareness that prevents disaster can prevent peace. The mind that sees everything rarely rests, and a mind that never rests eventually pays a price. Hyper-awareness begins as protection, but without balance it becomes burden. Without grounding it becomes distortion. Without emotional processing it becomes isolation. Batman stands on rooftops watching over a city that sleeps. The city rests. He does not, and that is where the danger truly begins. Seeing what others don't may sound like power, but power always carries a price. The mind that detects hidden patterns, subtle motives, and invisible threats does not simply gain knowledge. It absorbs weight. And the heavier the perception, the heavier the psychological burden becomes. Batman is often portrayed as strong, disciplined, and mentally unbreakable. But strength and strain can exist at the same time. The variability that makes him effective also isolates him. Because when you constantly see danger, you rarely feel safe. When you constantly detect deception, you rarely feel trust. When your mind never stops analyzing, you rarely feel peace. One of the first costs of heightened perception is isolation. Most people move through life accepting surface-level explanations. They take words at face value. They assume good intent unless proven otherwise. A hyper-aware mind does the opposite. It questions tone, pauses, inconsistencies, and contradictions. It searches beneath what is said. Over time, this creates distance. Batman does not sit comfortably in ordinary conversations. His mind is elsewhere, scanning, predicting, calculating. Even when surrounded by allies, he carries a mental world they cannot fully access. This is common among highly perceptive individuals. They often report feeling misunderstood, mentally out of sync with others, or detached from everyday social rhythms. Awareness separates. Another cost is chronic anxiety. The nervous system of a hyper-aware individual rarely powers down. Even in safe environments, the brain remains alert. It anticipates what could go wrong rather than what is going right. This is not deliberate pessimism. It is conditioned expectation. The mind has learned that danger can appear without warning. Batman embodies this constant anticipation. He prepares for worst-case scenarios. He builds backup plans for backup plans. He trains relentlessly not because he expects peace but because he expects disruption. While this preparation makes him formidable, it also keeps his body in a near-permanent stress response. And prolonged stress changes the brain. Research in psychology shows that chronic stress affects memory, emotional regulation, and even immune function. Cortisol levels remain elevated, sleep becomes fragmented, emotional tolerance decreases. Over time, hyperawareness can slowly transform into irritability, impatience, or emotional numbness. The brain adapts to intensity by reducing sensitivity. This leads to another psychological cost: emotional suppression. When a person constantly processes threats, emotions can feel like distractions. Vulnerability feels unsafe. Slowing down feels dangerous. Batman rarely allows himself emotional softness because softness feels like exposure. But suppressed emotion does not disappear. It accumulates. Unprocessed emotion often resurfaces as anger, rigidity, or detachment. A hyper-aware individual may appear calm and controlled externally, but internally there is tension. The mind is overloaded with data, scanning constantly, calculating constantly. Eventually, mental fatigue sets in. Decision fatigue is another hidden burden. The more possibilities you perceive, the more decisions you must evaluate. A typical person may see one or two options in a situation. A hyper-perceptive mind sees 10. Every conversation contains multiple interpretations. Every action contains multiple consequences. This creates cognitive overload. Batman constantly weighs outcomes. If I act now, what happens? If I wait, what changes? If I trust this person, what is the risk? If I do not trust them, what is the cost? Living in this constant evaluation mode consumes mental energy. Over time, it can lead to burnout. Burnout in hyper-aware individuals often looks different from ordinary exhaustion. It is not simply tiredness. It is mental saturation. The brain feels crowded. Thoughts feel relentless. Silence becomes uncomfortable because the mind fills it with analysis. Even rest becomes work. Another psychological danger is distorted perception. When someone constantly searches for patterns, the brain may begin connecting dots that do not belong together. This is where hyper-awareness can drift into paranoia. Not clinical paranoia necessarily, but a subtle, creeping suspicion of everything. Batman walks a thin line here. His world contains real threats, real deception, and real violence. But the habit of constant suspicion can expand beyond necessity. When vigilance becomes identity, neutrality becomes rare. The world starts to look like a battlefield even when it is not. This mindset reshapes relationships. Trust becomes conditional and heavily tested. Vulnerability becomes strategic rather than emotional. Even love becomes complicated because intimacy requires lowering defenses. For someone who has built their entire psychological structure around vigilance, lowering defenses feels unnatural. Highly perceptive individuals often struggle with this exact tension. They want connection, but connection requires risk. They want closeness, but closeness requires trust. Their minds analyze even affection, searching for inconsistencies. This creates internal conflict, the desire for connection versus the instinct for protection. There is also an existential cost. When you see structural flaws in systems, corruption in institutions, or hypocrisy in people, innocence fades. The world appears more complex and often darker. Optimism becomes cautious. Idealism becomes strategic. Batman does not see Gotham as hopeful. He sees it as fragile. Constant exposure to darkness affects worldview. The brain adapts to what it repeatedly processes. If it repeatedly processes threat, it begins to assume threat. If it repeatedly processes corruption, it begins to assume corruption. This cognitive shift shapes personality over time. Yet the greatest danger may be internal fragmentation. When identity fuses with vigilance, the individual begins to define themselves by what they fight against. Batman defines himself against crime. But what happens if crime disappears? Who remains? For hyper-aware individuals in real life, this question appears in quieter forms. If I am not analyzing, who am I? If I am not predicting, who am I? If I am not protecting, who am I? When awareness becomes the core identity, stillness can feel like emptiness. This is the paradox. The ability to see what others don't creates capability, intelligence, and strategic advantage. But it also increases emotional load, mental strain, and relational complexity. The sharper the perception, the heavier the responsibility feels. Batman stands as a symbol of this paradox. He is powerful because he sees more, but he is burdened because he sees more. His strength and his suffering originate from the same source. The danger of seeing what others don't is not that you will know too little. It is that you may never stop knowing. It is that your mind may never rest. It is that the world may begin to feel like a problem that must always be solved. And a mind that believes it must solve everything rarely allows itself to simply live. Seeing more than others can feel like power, but power without balance carries hidden dangers. The mind that constantly detects patterns, motives, and threats begins to create meaning where none exists. Observation turns into overinterpretation, and overinterpretation slowly becomes distortion. When hyperawareness dominates perception, reality itself can feel uncertain. The nervous system remains on high alert, and silence becomes uncomfortable. A simple pause in conversation may be interpreted as hostility. A delayed response may feel like rejection. Small tonal shifts may be read as manipulation. The mind begins to fill gaps in information with assumptions, and assumptions are often influenced by fear. The line between insight and paranoia starts to blur. Trauma strengthens these tendencies. The amygdala remains overactive, scanning constantly for threats. The prefrontal cortex, which normally regulates rational thought, is overridden by survival-driven processing. Logic begins to yield to emotional reasoning, and danger is assumed even when it does not exist. This is not irrationality, but an adaptive mechanism running unchecked. The brain seeks control in order to survive, but excessive control creates its own psychological prison. Hyperawareness turns against the individual, creating isolation, stress, and relational strain. The observer believes vigilance equals intelligence, but unchecked vigilance is exhausting. The mind can no longer rest, and even rest becomes mentally taxing. Batman illustrates this psychological pattern. His extraordinary perception allows him to detect criminal intent and prevent disaster, but it also traps him inside a constant state of anticipation. Stillness feels unsafe, relaxation feels dangerous, and control becomes the primary source of comfort. Every potential threat is calculated, and every ally is scrutinized. Preparation becomes compulsive because unpredictability has already caused trauma. While this preparation is effective, it reinforces stress and prevents emotional ease. The brain remains engaged in threat assessment, and physiological tension becomes chronic. Even when the city is calm, his mind continues to analyze every possible scenario, leaving no room for mental rest. Chronic stress reshapes both the brain and personality. Cortisol remains elevated, sleep becomes fragmented, and emotional tolerance decreases. Over time, the individual may experience irritability, impatience, or emotional numbness. Emotions that might interfere with vigilance are suppressed, but suppression does not erase feelings. It stores them. Unprocessed emotion emerges as anger, rigidity, or subtle withdrawal. Mental fatigue accumulates and cognitive overload sets in as the mind evaluates countless possibilities simultaneously. Every social interaction becomes a decision matrix, and every action carries multiple imagined consequences. The observer becomes trapped in a cycle of preparation, analysis, and evaluation. Burnout is inevitable. Distorted perception affects relationships. Trust becomes conditional, vulnerability is avoided, and connection feels risky. Even love is complicated because intimacy requires lowering defenses, something the hyper-aware mind finds unnatural. The desire for connection exists alongside the instinct for protection, creating internal conflict. Misinterpretation and hyperanalysis prevent simple enjoyment or spontaneity. Constantly detecting subtle threats or hidden motives changes one's worldview. Innocence fades, optimism weakens, and even idealism is filtered through caution. The world is no longer neutral. It is layered with potential hazards. Patterns emerge everywhere, even where they do not exist, and the line between reality and projection blurs. Internal identity is affected as well. When hyper-awareness fuses with vigilance, the self is defined by constant observation. Purpose and identity merge, leaving little room for ordinary existence. Batman defines himself against crime, but if crime disappears, what remains? Highly perceptive individuals in real life face a similar challenge. If they are not analyzing, predicting, or protecting, they may feel a void where purpose used to reside. Awareness becomes both the gift and the prison. The mind that sees too much cannot simply rest, and rest itself becomes psychologically threatening. This is the paradox of hyper-perception. It creates intelligence, strategic advantage, and the ability to act before others. Yet it also increases emotional strain, cognitive load, relational complexity, and the constant weight of vigilance. The sharper the perception, the greater the psychological responsibility. Batman's strength and his suffering share a common origin, his extraordinary awareness. The danger of seeing what others do not is not the knowledge itself, but the inability to ever stop perceiving. The mind that never rests becomes trapped in a world of constant evaluation, analysis, and anticipation. The observer may be powerful, but the psychological cost is immense. Ultimately, perception without regulation is not freedom. It is a form of captivity. The mind may solve problems before they occur, but it cannot relax, play, or experience ordinary peace. Awareness that is unbalanced becomes both tool and burden, power and limitation. For those who see what others cannot, vigilance feels necessary, rest feels unnatural, and connection feels risky. The danger is not that you will fail to notice the world, but that you will never allow yourself to fully live within it. The mind that believes it must solve everything rarely allows itself the grace to simply exist. Niccolò Machiavelli understood power in its raw, unfiltered form. He studied not morality but outcomes, not intentions but effects. Machiavelli recognized that people often hide their true motives behind appearances, politeness, and deception. To perceive these hidden motives is a skill. To act on them without attachment is mastery. Strategic perception is not instinct alone. It is cultivated discipline. It requires patience, observation, and the willingness to act when others hesitate. Batman embodies this principle. He does not simply react to crime. He anticipates behavior, studies patterns, and calculates consequences before a situation fully unfolds. The psychological principle behind Machiavellian perception aligns closely with hyper-awareness. When you constantly detect subtle shifts in people's behavior, you are essentially performing micro-level risk analysis. Every gesture, pause, and inflection is a potential clue. The mind becomes a predictive engine, mapping intention to outcome. For Batman, the city itself is a chessboard. Criminals are pieces, citizens are variables. Allies are both potential support and potential liability. This level of analysis requires exceptional cognitive discipline, but it also imposes a mental toll. Constantly mapping social interactions as threats or opportunities can erode emotional ease and increase relational strain. Machiavelli warned that human behavior is rarely pure. People act according to self-interest, fear, and desire for advantage. A hyper-aware observer internalizes this truth at every moment. Even trusted allies are monitored. Even allies' words are weighed for hidden meaning. This is not paranoia. It is a structured framework for understanding social dynamics. Yet over time, constantly interpreting every human action through the lens of strategy can distort empathy. Emotional responses become filtered through utility. Trust is measured in probability, not emotion. This cognitive approach enhances predictive accuracy but diminishes spontaneous relational connection. Strategic perception also creates internal tension. You recognize patterns, anticipate outcomes, and predict betrayal, yet you cannot fully control other people. This creates chronic uncertainty, even when your predictions are accurate. Batman experiences this in every interaction. He prepares for treachery before it occurs, but must navigate the psychological discomfort of realizing that no amount of planning can guarantee safety or cooperation. The observer learns that vigilance is never complete, even when foresight is exceptional. The psychological cost mirrors what we explored in Section 4. Hyper-awareness combined with strategic analysis amplifies mental load. The mind that calculates constantly cannot fully disengage. Decision fatigue accumulates. Emotional exhaustion becomes routine, yet the perceived advantages reinforce the behavior. The observer rationalizes, I must continue seeing, analyzing, predicting. Otherwise, I will fail. This cognitive feedback loop makes it difficult to rest or relax. Even leisure is filtered through analysis. Even reflection carries the weight of calculation. Machiavellian insight also intersects with moral ambiguity. Batman operates outside conventional morality at times because understanding human behavior requires flexibility. Strict adherence to moral absolutes limits perception and action. When the mind is attuned to strategy, outcomes sometimes outweigh ethics. This is psychologically challenging. The individual constantly balances personal values against practical necessity. The tension between morality and efficiency creates internal conflict. It also sharpens focus and decision-making skills. Those who manage this tension effectively gain extraordinary power. Those who fail may experience cognitive dissonance and psychological strain. Finally, strategic perception isolates the observer in subtle ways. When you see human behavior through the lens of motive, manipulation, and hidden intent, casual social interactions lose their spontaneity. People seem predictable yet unpredictable. Every statement may carry hidden significance. Every gesture may conceal intention. Trust is continually calculated, not freely given. The observer becomes aware of layers that others cannot perceive. This cognitive advantage, while invaluable in preventing harm and navigating complex environments, reinforces social distance. Emotional closeness requires vulnerability, but vulnerability becomes a calculated risk rather than an effortless experience. Batman exemplifies the intersection of hyper-awareness and strategic perception. His mastery of observation, anticipation, and tactical reasoning allows him to navigate Gotham's complex social and criminal networks with precision. Yet it also compounds the psychological burden of isolation, chronic vigilance, and moral tension. Understanding Machiavelli's principles reveals why perception, strategy, and analysis are double-edged. They create exceptional ability but also cultivate constant internal load. Awareness and intelligence are gifts, but without emotional regulation, they can become self-imposed prisons. Strategic perception teaches a harsh psychological truth. Knowledge without balance can be as dangerous as ignorance. The mind that understands too much about human behavior carries responsibility and vulnerability. It anticipates betrayal, predicts deception, and sees outcomes before they occur, yet cannot entirely escape uncertainty. The observer becomes both the strategist and the prisoner of their own mind, constantly weighing, analyzing, and preparing. This is the cost of seeing what others do not. The burden of hyper-perception intensified by strategic understanding and the delicate balance every highly aware individual must navigate to survive and remain functional. Hyper-awareness and strategic perception create power, but they also create profound isolation. When you see what others do not, ordinary social interactions begin to feel exhausting, trivial, or even unsafe. Conversations are filtered through a lens of analysis. Every word, tone, and gesture is evaluated for hidden meaning. Subtext becomes as important as text, and the constant mental effort separates the observer from those around them. Batman operates largely alone, not only because crime requires solitude, but because few can truly comprehend the cognitive world he inhabits. This pattern is mirrored in real-life, highly perceptive individuals, who often report feeling misunderstood, distant, and disconnected. Isolation is not merely physical, it is psychological. The mind of someone hyper-aware is constantly active, cycling through possibilities, evaluating risk, and predicting outcomes. While ordinary people relax, socialize, or engage emotionally, the hyper-aware mind is continuously scanning. Social gatherings may be mentally draining rather than enjoyable. Small talk may feel meaningless or even risky because the brain detects inconsistencies, hidden intentions, and subtle shifts that others cannot perceive. This persistent awareness produces fatigue, emotional exhaustion, and a sense of separateness from the world. While ordinary people relax, socialize, or engage emotionally, the hyper-aware mind is continuously scanning. Social gatherings may be mentally draining rather than enjoyable. Small talk may feel meaningless or even risky because the brain detects inconsistencies, hidden intentions, and subtle shifts that others cannot perceive. This persistent awareness produces fatigue, emotional exhaustion, and a sense of separateness from the world. Attempting intimacy requires vulnerability, but vulnerability carries perceived danger. Over time, the isolation effect reinforces itself. The more the observer detects threats or hidden meanings, the more they withdraw, and the more they withdraw, the greater the hyper-awareness intensifies. This cyclical dynamic can produce loneliness, resentment, and even subtle paranoia. Batman exemplifies the cost of the isolation effect in its extreme form. His work requires solitude, but his personality, shaped by trauma and hyper-awareness, reinforces it. Even allies who are trustworthy are treated with caution. Relationships become conditional and tactical rather than natural and emotionally fulfilling. Trust is continually assessed, and vulnerability is minimized. Emotional detachment develops not out of lack of feeling, but as a protective mechanism. Over time, the line between necessary caution and self-imposed isolation blurs. In real life, individuals who share similar perceptual intensity often experience analogous challenges. They report difficulty sustaining long-term friendships, feeling ahead or out of sync with conversations, and finding ordinary social cues insufficiently rich for their perceptual depth. Even positive social interactions can be mentally taxing because the mind is always analyzing hidden dynamics. The result is a subtle alienation that outsiders rarely recognize. The observer may appear confident, calm, or even superior, but beneath the surface lies fatigue, vigilance, and emotional isolation. The isolation effect also influences emotional processing. When connection feels risky, feelings are suppressed or deferred. Emotional expression is measured and controlled. Vulnerability is converted into strategy rather than intimacy. Over time, the observer may struggle to experience authentic closeness, empathy, or spontaneous joy. Relationships become transactional in subtle ways, as social energy is devoted to monitoring cues and evaluating intentions rather than freely participating. Isolation also exacerbates the psychological cost of hyper-awareness. Without others to provide perspective, reflection, or grounding, the mind can spiral into obsessive cycles of prediction and analysis. The observer may overestimate threats, magnify errors, or become preoccupied with hypothetical worst-case scenarios. This feedback loop heightens stress and cognitive load, reinforcing the sense of separation and the belief that solitude is necessary for safety and efficacy. Finally, the isolation effect shapes identity itself. When vigilance, perception, and analysis dominate, the observer begins to define themselves by their mental capacities and their ability to manage risk. The self becomes fused with purpose, and ordinary experiences of connection are deprioritized. For Batman, his identity is inseparable from his mission. For highly perceptive individuals in real life, a similar pattern can emerge. Identity is intertwined with hyper-awareness, leaving little room for ordinary leisure, vulnerability, or relational fluidity. Isolation, therefore, is both a consequence and a catalyst of hyper-awareness. It enables mastery, strategic insight, and survival, but it also reinforces loneliness, emotional strain, and relational difficulty. The observer becomes both the guardian of perception and the prisoner of solitude. Power comes at a cost, and for those who see what others cannot, the cost is often the quiet spaces of human connection that most take for granted. Default text. Hyper-awareness and strategic perception, when unchecked, can gradually evolve into paranoia. At first, heightened vigilance feels like intelligence. You notice subtleties others miss. You anticipate danger, you predict deception. This gives a sense of control and superiority. But over time, the mind begins to treat possibilities as probabilities and probabilities as certainties. The observer becomes preoccupied with what might go wrong, even in safe environments. Patterns emerge where none exist. Threats are imagined as often as they are real. The line between perception and projection begins to blur. For Batman, this is a constant tension. He anticipates criminal behavior before it occurs. He prepares contingency plans for every conceivable scenario. He monitors allies and enemies alike. Yet, no matter how thorough his preparation, uncertainty remains. The very ability to predict danger creates the psychological expectation of betrayal. When vigilance dominates thought, even benign behavior can appear suspicious. This is not merely strategy. It is the mind reshaping reality to fit hyper-aware expectations. Over time, constant scanning and anticipation foster a subtle, pervasive distrust. Paranoia is amplified when trauma intersects with intelligence. Early experiences of loss, danger, or betrayal sensitize the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. Threat detection becomes habitual and automatic. The observer no longer chooses to evaluate. Evaluation occurs involuntarily. Sleep may be restless because the mind continues scanning for signals of danger. Daily interactions become calculations. Casual remarks may be interpreted as criticism. Unintended glances or gestures are seen as hidden intentions. Even social warmth can be interpreted as manipulation. The observer lives in a perpetual state of anticipatory caution. Chronic hypervigilance combined with strategic thinking also amplifies emotional strain. Stress hormones remain elevated, creating physiological tension. Cognitive load is continuously high, and decision fatigue accumulates. Mental energy devoted to perceiving threats and analyzing behavior leaves less energy for emotional processing. Relaxation or creativity? Over time, this imbalance reinforces negative cognitive biases. Threats are overestimated. Safe situations are perceived as dangerous. Optimism and trust weaken. Social withdrawal becomes habitual. Isolation increases, further amplifying hyper-awareness. The observer becomes trapped in a cycle of vigilance, analysis, and anticipation. Paranoia also affects morality and judgment. When every action is interpreted through the lens of potential threat, ethical reasoning becomes strategic rather than principled. The observer begins to act preemptively to prevent harm or betrayal, even when such actions are unnecessary. In Batman's case, this manifests as preemptive planning and surveillance of both criminals and allies. In real-life hyper-perceptive individuals, the mind can produce intrusive thoughts about betrayal or deception. The brain's predictive function, once protective, now generates unnecessary stress. The descent into paranoia can subtly erode relationships. Others perceive hypervigilant behavior as distrust, controlling, or emotionally distant. Allies and friends may retreat, deepening the observer's isolation. Social cues are misread, intentions are overanalyzed, and even positive interactions are filtered through suspicion. Loneliness intensifies hyperawareness, and hyperawareness intensifies loneliness. The psychological spiral feeds itself. The observer becomes increasingly unable to differentiate between genuine threats and imagined dangers. Finally, paranoia alters identity. The observer begins to define themselves not only by what they detect, but by the threats they prevent. The self becomes fused with vigilance. Personal value is tied to predictive accuracy. Mistakes or miscalculations feel catastrophic. Relaxation, spontaneity, and vulnerability are interpreted as weaknesses. The observer's perception dominates their experience of the world. They see what others do not, but at the cost of constant mental vigilance and emotional fatigue. The very gift that offers insight now imposes burden. Batman's psychological pattern illustrates this extreme. His ability to anticipate crime, detect deception, and strategize provides enormous advantage. Yet it also creates perpetual tension, distrust, and isolation. Hyper-awareness becomes a double-edged sword. The sharper the perception, the heavier the psychological cost. Paranoia is the shadow side of vigilance, and the descent is gradual, almost imperceptible. By the time it is recognized, the mind is deeply enmeshed in cycles of suspicion, analysis, and preparation. The observer sees clearly, but cannot rest. The city sleeps, but the mind never stops. The lesson is universal. Hyper-awareness and perception are gifts only when balanced. Without grounding, emotional processing, and connection, vigilance becomes obsession. Strategic insight becomes suspicion. Intelligence becomes burden. The mind that sees too much is powerful, but it is never at ease. The descent into paranoia is subtle, cumulative, and psychologically taxing. It reminds us that seeing what others do not requires responsibility not just for action, but for mental and emotional balance. Hyper-awareness, strategic perception, and intense vigilance are gifts, but they carry profound psychological responsibility. The mind that sees what others do not is capable of insight, anticipation, and extraordinary problem-solving. Yet without balance, these capabilities can create isolation, stress, obsession, and paranoia. Integration is the process by which perception, emotion, and identity are brought into equilibrium. For both fictional archetypes like Batman and real-life highly perceptive individuals, integration is essential to transform the burdens of awareness into sustainable strength. Without it, perception can dominate life, shaping identity and experience in ways that are both powerful and restrictive. Integration begins with self-recognition. Acknowledge the shadow, as Carl Jung described, including both strengths and vulnerabilities. Recognize that hyper-awareness is adaptive, born from survival and intelligence, but it also creates blind spots in emotional and social functioning. Understanding the origins of vigilance allows the observer to contextualize their perceptions, separating necessary analysis from overinterpretation. When vigilance is understood as a tool rather than a defining identity, the mind begins to regain balance. Batman exemplifies this principle through disciplined reflection and self-imposed routines, controlling impulses and structuring perception without allowing it to dominate his humanity. Emotional regulation is the second pillar of integration. The mind that constantly predicts, analyzes, and anticipates must also learn to release tension and process emotion. Suppressed feelings accumulate as stress and fatigue, reducing cognitive flexibility and social connectedness. By consciously processing anger, fear, grief, and joy, hyper-aware individuals create space for both strategic perception and psychological resilience. For Batman, this may manifest in controlled outlets, meditation, or ritualized practices that allow emotional expression without compromising vigilance. In real life, mindfulness, journaling, therapy, or disciplined reflection serve a similar purpose, transforming hyper-awareness from burden into resource. The third aspect is relational grounding. Awareness can create isolation, but connection restores perspective. Trust, empathy, and vulnerability are essential for sustainable perception. The mind that perceives risk constantly benefits from reliable anchors, allies, friends, mentors, or supportive communities. For Batman, allies like Alfred and select trusted allies provide grounding, perspective, and reality checks. Without social anchors, even highly capable individuals may become trapped in cycles of suspicion, paranoia, and isolation. Integration requires deliberate cultivation of connection while maintaining perceptual clarity. Social bonds become a stabilizing counterweight to the mind's vigilance. Cognitive flexibility is the fourth pillar. The hyper-aware mind must learn to distinguish between real threats and imagined possibilities. Strategic perception is most effective when it is directed rather than automatic. Overinterpreting cues or predicting non-existent dangers creates unnecessary stress and cognitive fatigue. Integration involves training the mind to evaluate information critically, recalibrate assumptions, and release unnecessary mental load. Batman demonstrates this through rigorous planning, yet he also recognizes limitations, choosing when to act and when to observe. In real life, setting cognitive boundaries and prioritizing attention transforms hyper-awareness into deliberate insight rather than compulsive analysis. The fifth element is ethical alignment. Machiavelli's lessons on strategy illustrate that perception is morally neutral. It can serve protection or manipulation. Integration requires conscious ethical reflection, ensuring that insight is used constructively rather than destructively. Hyper-aware individuals must balance vigilance with empathy, intelligence with compassion, and prediction with moral judgment. Batman walks this line, using his strategic perception to protect Gotham rather than dominate it. In real life, maintaining ethical clarity prevents hyper-awareness from justifying control, manipulation, or self-serving decisions, ensuring that insight benefits both self and society. Finally, integration involves identity harmonization. Hyper-awareness often fuses with personal identity, creating tension when the observer is not actively vigilant. Integration separates identity from function. Perception becomes a tool rather than the defining core of self. This creates space for rest, recreation, vulnerability, and ordinary human experience. Awareness can remain sharp without dominating life. Strategic thinking can guide action without eroding emotional richness. Connection and purpose coexist with vigilance. Insight becomes sustainable, and perception transforms from burden to empowerment. Batman's resilience is rooted in this balance, maintaining purpose without allowing vigilance to consume his humanity. Ultimately, integration is the process of transforming the danger of seeing what others do not into mastery of self and environment. Awareness, vigilance, and strategic perception remain, but they operate within a framework of emotional balance, social connection, ethical reflection, and identity stability. The mind is no longer a prisoner of its own insight, but a tool for meaningful action. Those who cultivate this integration achieve clarity, resilience, and functional intelligence. They see deeply, anticipate effectively, and live fully without being consumed by the very gifts that make them extraordinary. Hyper-awareness is no longer a burden. Strategic perception no longer isolates. Insight no longer overwhelms. Vigilance is calibrated. Emotions are processed. Relationships are strengthened. Identity is harmonized. The mind rests in deliberate observation, capable of both action and stillness. The danger of seeing what others do not is transformed into wisdom, resilience, and balanced perception. Through integration, the observer becomes whole.